We have Mr. Westby discussing Moore's Law.
This really is exciting. What's exciting is this, is what Mr. Fry put it. It really is. Well, anyway, I want to talk a little bit about Moore's Law and some of the offshoots of that whole idea and how it really has affected your lives more than you can even imagine. And I'm looking at some of the people in the room over on this side and Mr. Hamele over on the back edge of this, but we were kind of at the beginning of this law. I was 4 years old and so on as these things came to be. I had no idea what it was all about. So we're going to look at this and how it affects you today, which is pretty amazing. Point at the computer.
No, anywhere you want. Don't need a point.
Great. All right. Well, anyway, Moore's Law in its current term talks about microprocessor speed. You'll hear it talk that. It was originally looking at how the number of transistors in a little circuit board, silicon wafer that's like 1 inch in diameter, the number of transistors packed into there would double every year. That was the first observation that was made. But it's had some offshoots now from that I want to get into. I want to talk a little bit about how transistors are made, how that works, and the evolution of where transistors came from. So that's kind of what we'll talk about today, me and my schizophrenic self. So it really wasn't an original statement. Okay, so this is 1965. And once that statement was put in there, it really kind of started a race in the computer industry and in the microprocessor industry. That if we can make things smaller, that means we can make things faster, we can make things more powerful. So those were some of the ramifications that came from that statement. So it wasn't just like an observation. It then kind of drove, and it's still driving the industry. Can we keep up with this idea? Will things keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and packing things and doubling as the years go on? And this chart goes up to 2011. We see that it's still holding true. But notice it's a logarithmic scale. So if we were to do this, it's an exponential growth as it works out. Okay? So that logarithmic scale, if you recall logarithms, every one is 10 times greater than the next. It's not a nice even scale. So even though it's a linear line, it's an exponential growth that's going on. So this kind of maps a little bit in number form how it works. It goes from 1970s to early 2000s. And we're looking at different things that increase with that time. So the number of transistors packed on, we see, are increasing. The space between them is decreasing, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we see that the speed is also increasing. And so they've looked at that and they've turned Moore's Law now fits into more than just the transistors. We're talking about the clock speed of the computers. We're talking about the power that they work under as well, which is kind of amazing. And it all kind of fits the same exponential growth, as we'll see a little later. So let's look at this evolution. So it's about controlling electrons. That's what it's all about. It's about controlling electrons. And way back when, people started to figure out they knew how to work with electrons, and it was the technology that was driving society at that time. I mean, they knew how to work with electrons. They knew how the telegraph worked. They were doing with wireless communications before they even knew what an electron was. They saw these things happen. So the science behind the technology wasn't there yet until they found those things out. Nowadays, it's the other way around. The science is there, and technology is lagging behind trying to keep up with the scientific discoveries of the day. And one of those is making things smaller and smaller. Instead of things we can see, we're talking things that are on the nano scale. Who's heard of like nanotechnology? And how much of a meter is 1 nanometer? 10 to the minus 9. 10 to the minus 9. So it's a billionth of a meter. So we're talking small beyond small. We can't see things like that with a light microscope, which is kind of amazing. And they're trying to make transistors down in that scale now. You can't even see it with a light microscope, yet they can create these things. That's kind of amazing when you really think about it. So we're able to control electrons. And early on, we can control electrons and we can make lights go on. The electrons go through a little filament, they heat it up. Great. But now we're looking at controlling electrons by making electrons do certain things, and they change the crystal structure in your LCD TV to make it be your red or your blue or your green light come on at those different crystals. That's much different than just making a light bulb come on. And that's the power of these transistors that control your lives and mine. So back in the 1940s, this is what a computer really looked like back in the 40s. This is ENIAC. This is a big U.S. Army computer that was used at the tail end of World War II. I mean, it took up rooms. And to power these, they used what were called vacuum tubes. Now, a vacuum tube is just what it sounds like. It's a tube that's had the air evacuated from it. And there's metal plates in this tube. And the electrons are able to control across those metal plates. They're kind of like a gate or a faucet. So we can have electrons on one side of the faucet do one thing, electrons on the other side do a whole other thing. So the amount of current can be controlled on the side of these. Now I have some samples of these. These are vacuum tubes. I'd kind of not like to pass them around with this large of a crowd, but so this is how they control the electrons and something like that. Now I'll punch through a few more here. My hands are full, so Ellie, you can click through a couple more of those while I'm doing that. Okay. So we see a couple other slides here. Look at that guy. He's got that's styling. I hiked him up a little bit. So go back one more. So all these cables. Now I'll go to the next one. To program this computer, they had to take these cables and they had to go in different patterns in order to program the computer to do different things. Pretty amazing. And then on the back side of all of this, go ahead. These are all vacuum tubes on the back side of all that. So it's all these things that act like little gates as they're trying to program what's going on. That's crazy. These things blow out. You can see that side, this is all silver because the metal has been blasted or vaporized onto the inside of this. So this one's no good anymore. And remember as a child, 1960s, our TV glowed in the back, like glowed, because these things were in the back to help power the TV, to make it do what it's supposed to do. And then when the TV went bad, either the TV repairman came to your house because the thing was too heavy to move, or my dad would look back there and goes, oh, that one's burned out. He'd pull that one out, we'd go down to the drugstore, we'd plug it into this machine, and see, yep, that one's bad, and we'd go and, oh, here's the one we need, go home and we plug it into our TV. We don't do that nowadays. We can't do that nowadays, because the transistors that make up the same circuit are so tiny, we couldn't even go in and figure out which one's bad, okay, if that's what's wrong with it. So these are our vacuum tubes. Pretty awkward things if you really think about it. Let's see, I'll get my slide number right here. So the first computers used vacuum tubes. Go ahead and click. We'll see where we go. This is a television from like the 1950s, and the back side of it had tubes in them. They're fairly large items. This is about this big. And nowadays, TVs have much different screens. One of the reasons they were so large is because of the screens themselves. And we don't use those screens really pretty much anywhere, except in our computers here, because this is our vintage computers. Same idea. Voting machines. Let's see, get it right thing. And television, radios, they were very large and very hot because of this. This generates a lot of heat. Let's see what the next slide is. Great. Well, usher in the transistor. This is the first transistor that was made. It's about this big, okay, developed in Bell Laboratories. And it uses what are called semiconductors. Now, semiconductors, many of you have heard of, they allow electricity to be controlled a little more specifically. Like I can make a semiconductor that would accept electrons, or a semiconductor that will donate electrons. And when we start working with those, we can control electrons real specifically. So this is the first transistor. It looks pretty darn awkward compared to what transistors are today. So I'll pass this around because I have some of these on here. These were vacuum tubes. I hot glued them on. These are some transistors, current packages, if you will, that transistors come in now that we use in our electronics class, for example, because we can hang on to those and we can put them into different things. So I only have one that's kind of small to pass around, so you can see they're kind of like this now. So it's much smaller than the vacuum tube. So right away you can see we can make things smaller very quickly if we use these transistors. Let's see. Now.
Would Ms. Hall please call
This is a
extension
huge, huge
1106?
leap, as you
Ms.
can
Hall,
imagine.
please dial extension
So usher in the
1106.
1960s. Now I remember seeing so many things in the 1960s that said solid state. Why do you think they call it solid state? Anybody? What's that? There's really no moving parts. There's no vacuum tubes. So if I drop the thing, if these little transistors are solid, it's solid material. It's not a tube that's made out of glass and there's air and metal in there. So it's solid state age. So I have a solid state TV from the 1970s right here. It even says solid state right on it. That's supposed to be really good, right? And if I open up in the back, it would have like a circuit board that might look something like this in the back of it. This is out of a VCR. Okay, just so it would have some circuits on there with different components other than what a transistor would be. Okay, let's see where I'm at here. So this begins to miniaturize things. So I could take components that I have in my lab over there, and I could plug this in and make this little circuit. It looks pretty complicated. There's not many different things to it. Well, researchers in the 1950s, they created this thing called an integrated circuit, which this is. This whole circuit is smaller than your fingernail. And they layer this onto semiconductor materials. So this is called an integrated circuit. Many of you have heard of these before. They abbreviate them ICs. Now these are amazing things. This little integrated circuit will allow you to do different oscillators and things like that. A pretty simple standard one that you use in beginning electronics courses. Okay? And so this is the 1950s that we get this, and we can see this is even smaller. Now I got all of this on the size that's like my fingernail. Well, they're even smaller than this, incredibly smaller than this. So there's the gate there. Let's see, I think this is slide 13. I numbered them, but I didn't have my numbers on there, so I don't know what's what here. So let's go one more. So the solid state age that came in. Remember that? I remember vividly the first Walkman that I saw. It's like 1979, 1980. This guy goes, look what I got. It's like this Sony Walkman. And he's so cool. He's got headphones on. It's like, wow, this so neat. Plays a cassette tape. Okay, that's pretty crazy stuff. The hairstyle, that's happening. That's coming down. You know, and so it's literally like this big, but that's pretty small if you think about it. So we're getting smaller and smaller. Instead of having a tape player or some big recorder or a boom box, hey, we got something that's portable now because those components are getting smaller and smaller. Remember, we're not only doubling the speed at which things are moving, we're doubling how many things we can pack into a given space. It's like we have this many people in the room today, and then a year from now we have this many people double in the same space. And we can still do the same things. We don't feel crowded. And then another year we double that number. Okay, so now we're even more people, and we can still do the same things. We don't feel crowded. Okay, kind of an important point. Well, then the Sony Discman comes along. We can store information better. We can access it better. It's about the same size, a little bigger than the Walkman. iPod Nanos. Okay, I like that picture. It's got it all in there. It's the iPod deal. Even smaller still. Even more information can be stored on this. Even faster processing speeds happen in this than we could even imagine. Now, I heard it said a couple weeks ago that your smartphones that you have more processing power than the computers that sent the Apollo missions to the moon. Now, you weren't alive at the Apollo missions, but I think you have an idea of what that means. You're holding more computing power in your hand than computers that send rockets to the moon and get man on the moon. That's kind of an amazing thing. And Moore's Law kind of steps into that whole concept, that we can speed things up and we can cram more things into certain spaces, and because we're closer together, we speed transactions up between the electrons. Okay? Just like if we're all packed in here real tight, somebody gets sick, that illness will pass through us rather quickly because we're really closely packed. But if we were like 5 or 6 people in this whole room, the likelihood of that illness spreading is less because we have more space between them. That's kind of a way to think about this idea of how electrons are able to move through a circuit. The closer you get those, the fewer electrons you need to do the job, and the faster you can get those processors to work. Incredible. Okay? So back to Moore's Law. This processing speed. Now, you can't read some of these. They have a few of the Macintosh versions in here, but it's mostly Intel because Mr. Moore was a co-founder of the Intel Corporation. So obviously Intel is going to have a major stake in this whole deal. The way the processors are made is pretty amazing. If I have a few minutes, I want to talk about that, but I'm not sure where we'll end up here for time. So this slide kind of puts all those parameters together. This says, okay, early on, we had electromechanical ways to deal with electrons and to move them through. And then relays are electromagnetic relays have a coil in them, and it allows switches to go on and off. So these different switches would go on and off within a computer. Vacuum tube age, transistor age, we're in this integrated circuit age. And notice what this does. It follows a curve as well, not only for dealing with the transistors, but as the title on the axis says, it's calculations per second for $1,000 of computing power. So we're getting more and more bang for the buck with our computers. And you know that. There's kind of a joke that if you buy your computer today, you bring it home, and by the time you have it unboxed, it's already obsolete, right? And it's kind of true. And some of the ads on TV that you see that way, it's got the person's on their smartphone and they look over and they see their other person's smartphone. Oh, okay? And it's kind of true. It's kind of true. That's why I'm bucking the smartphone, Sam. All right. So that's Moore's Law in a nutshell and some of the ramifications that we feel. And as I said, industry is kind of driven by that. Can it hold true? So that's a big question. Can Moore's Law still hold true? Well, this slide illustrates how they build these integrated circuits nowadays. Now I have a copy, well, it's not a copy, it's a real one, but it broke. They start out with silicon. They get the silicon from sand, and they process it so it's pure silicon. And they create what's called a billet, or an ingot. And it's about this big around, and they're about this long, and they slice them like a pepperoni. Slice, 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 really thin, depending how the thickness depends on the process that they want to put through, put the integrated circuit through. And then you can pass this around a little bit, and I have a bunch to give people, but we'll start that over there. You'll see on that, it looks like a grid work, and each one of those grids, each one of those parts of the grid is a processor, where they've layered and layered transistors into the silicon wafer. Now we have a bunch of these. See if you can dig around and find some that are like that. That'd be great. Just dig around and find a bunch that are like that, and we'll start spreading those around. Now each one of those little squares on that Jolene has is a processor. And it's been layered. It's not just, you just don't have components kind of sticking out like on this piece right here. It doesn't look like that. It's in layers and layers. And the way that they make the layers, you can see this would be 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers, and 4, so forth. What they do is they put down a certain material on top of the silicon, and then they take what's called a photolithograph, which they take a photograph that they magnify from a very small thing, and then they shrink it down so it fits in a very small area. And that creates what's called a resist layer. Now, that layer then resists a chemical process and leaves behind a certain pattern on that layer of the silicon, like this. So I have here, in electronics, we start out with just a copper plate like this. And then we put resist on it, and then etch away the copper. So we end up with a certain pattern. That's our circuit. And then they'll put another layer on of resist. And they'll add another layer, and then they'll add resist, they'll add another layer, add resist. And they keep building these layers, one on top of the other. And they're very complex. So each of these layers has been eaten away, and then add some more layer, eat some more away, so they get this pattern to form between the silicon layers. Okay, so far so good? Okay, next slide. See how that works. Now, these layers, you can see, this layer is not connected with this layer at all, the way that they put the resist down. So this allows for gates to form within the different layers. And those gates are the transistors that make up the semiconductors that you see that's coming around right there. Okay, it's pretty amazing. It's totally amazing. And, well, I don't think I'll explain that. So the information that we are processing today is much different than it was, in that the way it's manipulated in the computer. Like we started out, if you remember back, I don't know if you remember these are called punch cards. This is the way computers used to analyze information. And it was electromechanical that they come through, and you can see how this might introduce that ones and zeros idea. That if I have some information coming through here, every time you see a hole, that would be a 1 to turn on a switch. And every time there's not a hole in this time period, the switch would stay off. So that could introduce the ones and zeros idea. Right? All good with binary code? Back then, with punch cards, this is 5 megabytes of information. Okay? This is the 1940s. This is 5 megabytes of information. Now, this is ridiculous. Like, we can buy thumb drives with a lot more information than that. Then in the early days of computers, back in the 1970s and early 80s, These are mainframe computers. Information is stored on these large reels, and they'd have to access the reels are spinning, and then they'd stop, and then those reels would spin and stop, and it would do all the information that you need to code in and get the information back from. Kind of amazing. Then there came the diskette. This is back in personal computer time, 1980s, okay, the floppy disk, okay, crazy stuff. Anybody still have one of these around? I couldn't find one today, otherwise I'd have one. You got some? Oh, he's got some. This was it. Oh yeah, that was crazy. And then the diskettes. Oh yeah, anyone use these ever? They don't even make computers. Oh, we got one nod. They don't even make computers with these anymore. And I have a whole bunch of information stored on them. And then the thumb drive. Okay. I love this
Creepy.
This has so much more information capability storage than those other disks had and ever will have, just because of the limitations within the material itself. Okay?
That's not right.
So the question is, will Moore's law continue to hold true? Are there limitations to what Moore's law can have? And if you look at it, it's got to stop somewhere. And some researchers are thinking that's going to be in the next 5 or 10 years that Moore's law is going to start to level off because we can't get small enough. But there's huge advances in the what's the term I'm looking for, Mr. Dobson, where you have well, they're looking at how electrons can be transferred down at a cellular level, and that it's not just going to be something we paint down with silicon, but it's actually more organic in living tissue. So that's kind of a crazy thought that could happen. I just read today, actually, that MIT has found that they're getting things smaller than 25 nanometers, that they're able to make these transistors even smaller and smaller still. So that's the big question. And you're living right on the edge of this, which is kind of cool. So if you get into any sort of computing at all, I'm sure you're going to be having to wrestle with this concept. So, yeah, that's how it probably broke earlier.
So what?
So that's it. If you no, that's just a question. So if you feel like you have to go, it's 3:30 or so. Why don't you go ahead? If you want to stick around for a couple of questions, I'll try to answer some.
Would the limit be like atoms of space between these transistors?
You would think so. That's my answer. You would think so, but you just don't know, right?
Wouldn't that whole cellular level of transistors and such, wouldn't that get to the point where I guess to a transhumanist state where a person could be part machine naturally?
Like I could swallow a pill and it would integrate into
No,
my
more
system?
like making yourself the missing link between man and machine.
Oh, possibly. But like I said, the transistors now are smaller than human cells. Right now. So,
Right now?
hey, thanks for coming. Right now,
Yeah, I
yes.
guess we can do that now.